So I will just, first of all, thank you very much, the two speakers, Christoph Markschies and Jay Bregman, to have accepted to be here today with us, and also the people who are present in the room. Anna van der Kerchove will record the conferences, and they will be available in the next week on the YouTube channel of the project. This session will be, Eric Reger was unable to attend in the last minute, so I will chair the first part of our meeting, and Dylan Burns will share the second part. And I'm very happy to have in the second part Jay Bregman, who is from the University of Maine, and is a specialist in particular of Synesius of Cyrene, and he will talk about Martianus Capella. And in this first part, I have the great pleasure to welcome Professor Christoph Markschies of the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin and of the Brandenburgische Akademie von Wissenschaften, who is, of course, a specialist of the ancient Christianity, and who has, among his extensive bibliography, published in 2016 a monograph on the body of God, and in 2019, with Einar Thomassen, a volume dedicated to the Valentinism. So without further observations, I give you the words. Thank you very much.
Dear Luciana, dear Anna, dear all, a very wonderful afternoon. Perhaps first a remark to the context of my approach this afternoon. I'm preparing since many, many years after I have written a monograph, my thesis on the beginnings of one branch of the so-called Gnostic movement, the Valentinianism in Rome, which was my thesis on Valentinus, the alleged founder, a monograph on the later texts of the movement. And one of the most interesting texts of this movement is the so-called Grande Notice. I will explain what this is. And what I'm doing today is, after I have published a philological introduction into the manuscripts and on the literary genre, now the first part of the commentary, because the thesis is that's an attempt to be involved in the discussion, in the contemporary philosophical discussion on principles. And that I will try to argue this afternoon in the 30 minutes of my lecture or paper. So the title is Middle Platonic Principles and the Grande Notice. First, a brief preliminary remarks on the title of my contribution and something about the content and the subparts I will deal with. What the theory of principles means in what we have been calling Middle Platonism, for example, in the German-speaking world since the last century, Karl Prechter, I presumably do not have to explain, especially in our context. Under this keyword, Middle Platonic Principles, I presumably do not have to explain, especially that I summarize the different attempts, the very different attempts of the corresponding sources to explain the basic principles, God, gods, ideas, or that's in especially the German language, a very difficult term, so better noetical principles or noetical forms or something like this. Ideas is misleading in the German context, perhaps also in other languages, and matter. In doing so, it must of course be noted from the outset how differently the relation of tohen, demiurgos, idea to agatou, nous, theoi, and so far is. I will concentrate today on Numenius and Moderatus. These are the two authors I would like to compare the Grande Notice, and it's quite clear these are extremely difficult authors in regard of the theory of principles. So I apologize for having dealt with these complicated matters in half an hour. And the only thing I would like to argue is not a dependency of the Grande Notice from these two authors, but the same milieu, the interest to step in a discussion which is represented to a certain extent by these two authors. And we will see that the literary levels and also the levels of knowledge between the two philosophers and the Gnostic Grande Notice is quite different. So what I should explain first is what is Grande Notice. Some of you are quite familiar with, others probably not. To level up our common knowledge, I should a little bit explain. The term Grande Notice is usually understood to mean the introductory 8 chapters in the great anti-heretical work of Irenaeus of Lyon. This is the classical Source Chrétienne edition I will talk about, and there is since some month a new edition in a Spanish series, which I will only pass by. Irenaeus is a Gaul Christian bishop from Lyon, but spent a longer time in Rome so that he personally was familiar with those Gnostics he was dealing with. The term Grande Notice or Grand Notice, familiar especially in the context of early Christian scholars. This term was coined by the French Dominican François Sagnard in his 1947 monograph, La Gnose Valentinienne et le témoignage de Saint Irénée. And for the first chapters of this large 5-volume monograph of the Bishop of Lyon. Sagnard, however, does not explain the term, but introduces him without comment in the preface to his monograph. Today, we mostly quote, when quoting those first 8 chapters, the Greek text, which is written in the monograph of Sagnard, here in the Rousseau d'Outreleo edition, and also in the Spanish edition. We quote the Greek text. Also, the Greek text, in fact, is contaminated in the textual transmission citation in the late 4th century work of Epiphanius of Salamis. So we have 2 textual contaminations. A contaminated Greek text was incorporated by Epiphanius in a also contaminated, transmitted work of Epiphanius from the end of the 4th century. And there is another problem. There is a Latin translation of the probably late 4th century, first cited by Augustine, and it's a little bit unclear where this translation was made. So the textual problem of the text is quite large, and I'm not dealing today with this textual problem, but the Source Chrétienne edition is extremely problematic because the Greek text was taken from the Berlin Corpus edition of Epiphanius by Karl Holl, and the Latin texts collations from the surviving manuscripts were done a little bit careless, and there are not better collations for the Spanish edition. So the edition of Epiphanius is missing, and what I'm explaining today is only, how to say, a preliminary interpretation on the basis of a late Greek text based or contaminated in a double way, and a Latin text not presented in a convincing edition. So these as something concerning the textual transmission. Now, what we have in hand with these 8 chapters, and there is an interesting observation. Often one can read that this is taking for granted the dual of esoteric and exoteric text, that this should be considered an esoteric text. Why this is interpreted, the Grande Notice, the 8 chapters of Epiphanius, as an esoteric text, because another Valentinian text, the letter of Ptolemy to Flora, is taken as an exoteric text because he is directed to a Roman learned woman called Flora. Also a text in a doubled, contaminated way transmitted by Epiphanius. But if one is comparing our 8 chapters with other Platonic texts from imperial Roman time, it's quite clear that it is full of mythological narratives, and so it's quite clear that we have here not an esoteric text, but an exoteric text. And the interesting question is, what is for these exoteric narratives, mythological narratives, the esoteric text? And here we have to declare quite openly, not survived. So we have no, until now, perhaps with the exception of certain very small lines cited by Irenaeus in his work, we have no no esoteric interpretation for the exoteric mythological narrative in Irenaeus, and that's a problem. Most interpretations of the 8 chapters in Irenaeus of the Grande Notice are neglecting that it is only an exoteric text, and to interpret the teaching of the Valentinian Gnostics, we have to realize that we have to reconstruct the esoteric teaching of these people from the mythological. It's like to reconstruct from the from Plato, from the well-known narratives of Plato or Plutarch, the mythological narratives, the agrapha dogmata. And what I'm doing in my approach is asking for the agrapha dogmata of the mythological narrative. And if we are interpreting this text this way, then the striking similarities to imperial Platonic and Neo-Pythagorean discussions on the principles are clearly visible. The interesting question is, are there any proofs for my access to the text? Yes, there are, because we have a very small fragment in Irenaeus where a clear-cut discussion on the distinction between tohen, monas, monotes, and henotes is given, which is in a very surprising way different from the mythological narrative birth of certain entities and debates and struggles between these entities. And so the different literary styles and approaches are an argument for that they not only copied the mythological exoteric narratives, but they had also esoteric philosophical treatises or only an oral teaching in the schools we can reconstruct, for example, for the city of Rome. We know something about the date of the author and of the literary genre of the Grande Notice. Date is something in between 160, 180 AD. Why? The work of Irenaeus is composed somewhere in around 185. There is a new approach concerning a first edition that is not convincing, but I will skip these problems. So 160 between 180. Why 160? Because according to Irenaeus, the text was written by the pupils of the Roman teacher Ptolemy. And those teachers, these pupils of the Roman teacher Ptolemy, labeled themselves pupils of Valentinus. So Ptolemy was probably a pupil of Valentinus. Why the pupils of Ptolemy labeled themselves pupils of Valentinus, perhaps of certain problems of Ptolemy, I will also skip, but it's quite clear that the Grande Notice is not a text of Ptolemy himself. We have only the mentioned letter to Flora from Ptolemy, but it's a text of the pupil of Ptolemy, so third generation of the Valentinian movement. First, the Haereses Eponymos Valentinus, something around 140, 50, then Ptolemy, 150 to 160, then the pupil of Ptolemy, themselves labeling as the pupils of Valentinus, and somewhere in between 160, death of Ptolemy and the way out of Valentinus to Cyprus, and the writing of Irenaeus, this text came together. And so it's quite near to Numenius and in certain distance to Moderatus, but these are all not very precise informations, also not for Numenius and Moderatus. And the last question, what is the literary genre? The literary genre is, when analyzing the text, a mythological narrative with certain commentaries. So it's not a text, how to say, the first sketch of a text, but obviously a text which was commented, a kind of second edition, or something where by the Valentinians, the pupils of Ptolemy, certain elements were brought in. This is quite clear by certain Greek elements in style. This means, or this can be explained as. So a second layer of commentary was already done of the mythological text. So this as a kind of introduction to the text. There is at the moment, except the two volumes of the Spanish and the French edition, no commentary which explains the texts, not in a way Homer by Homer explaining. Most of the Gnostic texts in our tradition are commented by Gnostic texts. So the question is how those Grande Notice is related to the Nag Hammadi text. But I think the milieu, and as we clearly will see in some seconds, the whole question and discussion is related to a discussion on the principles. For reasons of time, I'm now not able to comment the whole 8 chapters, and will only comment 2 passages at the beginning. But you will easily realize that what I'm explaining for the first two paragraphs can be continued for the whole following discussion on the question of how matter comes in and how the visible sensual world was created, and all these questions. I begin with the beginning of the Grande notice in an English translation. They maintain they are the pupils of Ptolemy, which label themselves the pupils of Valentinus. This is a redactional note by Irenaeus. They maintain then that in the invisible and ineffable heights above there exists a certain perfect pre-existent eternity. The interesting thing is that in most of the Greek and French and German translations, here are standing Greek terms, untranslated Greek terms, which is quite surprising because no translation operates with untranslated terms. And this is one of the reasons why it looks like a mythological drama and not like a philosophical text. So there exists a certain perfect pre-existent eternity, there is the Greek word aion, whom they call pre-beginning, pro-arche, pre-father, pro-pator, and depth, butos, and describe as being invisible and incomprehensible, eternal and unbegotten. It, he, or whatever, remained throughout innumerable cycles of ages in profound serenity and silence. This is a kind of explanation which is not mythological, but using how to explain certain terms, philosophical, not clear-cut and highly professional philosophical terms, but attempts to use philosophical terms with a certain tendency of marking the transcendency, the pro. It's all thing pro-arche. And if we try to compare the description, then we got the impression it's not clear-cut linkable to a certain Platonic philosopher or Neo-Pythagorean philosopher precisely, but it's a certain attempt to move in the discussion. Christians of the 2nd century, not trained in Alexandria or not trained in the philosophical schools of the time, but people familiar with the teaching and interested to move in the discussion, tried to set up something which is for their impression in a certain way, something which is worth of discussion. And this, the fact that this is not clear-cut linkable to a certain theory, we easily can realize by comparing to, for example, the ideas of Numenius on the protos theos. Because there are certain similarities, but also great differences. The protos theos of Numenius is holy with himself, simple and indivisible, because he only consorts with or relates to himself, and as a king is inactive and free from all works. And compared with the deuteros theos, he is perfectly unmoved and rest. I'm talking on the fragments 15, de Place, fragment 21, fragment 22, and are putting together the informations from these fragments. According to Numenius, the first god has a peculiar movement, kinesin symphyton, as it is said in fragment 15, which in turn is the cause of the order, existence, and well-being of the cosmos. Numenius can describe the relationship of the first to the second god as that of father and son, fragment 21, and he formulates that the first things with the aid of this second, and links this with Timaeus, the second god, reason, fragment 22. And if we have this in mind, the differences to the Grande Notice are quite clear, but also the similarities. It's in some way in the discussion. This, and I'm continuing now my citation of the English translation of the Grande Notice. There existed along with him, so the first eternity, the unmoved first principle, the act of thinking, which they also call grace and silence. And here I have to introduce as a kind of excursus that there is also an attempt to put into the contemporary discussion of the principles biblical terms. So by id est, that means the how to say, coloring of the philosophical terms by biblical terms. And that's probably the guiding or leading interest of these people to explain biblical texts by certain elements of a philosophical theory of principles, and to present what we have in the biblical text is able for the, or is fitting for discussion at the marketplace of the philosophers. I continue Irenaeus. At last, this depth, the butos, the first eternity, determined to send forth from himself the beginning of all things, and deposited his production in this contemporary silence, even as seed is deposited in the womb. And I'm not continuing the whole thing here. The whole text of the Grande Notice becomes quite more mythological, birth and later struggle and other things. She then, having received this seed, so she, the second principle, and becoming pregnant, gave birth to reason, nous, who was both similar and equal to him who had produced him. There is a kind of similarity to the first principle, and was alone capable of the comprehending his father's greatness. The nous they call also only begotten, monogenes, another attempt to link a philosophical term with a biblical term, especially from John and Paul, and father, and the beginning of all things. We have the forefather and the father. Along with him was also produced truth, aletheia, and these four constituted the first and first begotten Pythagorean tetrad, tetras, which they also denominate the root of all things. And now it's quite clear that we have to introduce, to compare also Neo-Pythagorean thinker, and I will continue my comparison, similarities and differences with Moderatus. Also, which is quite clear, this is extremely difficult. In Lachmann's edition, Moderatus are a quite small number of pages, and especially the Simplicios in his commentary on Aristotle's Physica, the Physica, is a quite difficult text. What is Simplicios, which is Porphyrius he is citing, and which is Moderatus. But I cite in this, also by Dörrie-Baltes cited paragraph, the introduction where Simplicius is describing Moderatus' interpretation of Plato. It's a quite difficult arrangement. Moderatus on Plato in the words of Simplicius. For Plato, according to the doctrine of the Pythagoreans and Moderatus, this is Simplicius, sets the first one above being and all substance. as the first being in the Grande Notice. Of the second one, which is the truly existing and intelligible, he says it is the ideas. And this is the thing which is extremely comparable to our text, because from the first one and the thought of the first one, a kind of ideas and the news is coming out. It's quite clear that is seen from the perspective of a professional Platonic or Neo-Pythagorean philosopher, and not really convincing, because the introduction of biblical terms, because of the bringing in of the Pythagorean four tetrad and other things. But it's an attempt to move into this discussion, like people coming in and explaining, here I am, please discuss with me. Because for reasons of time, I should only speak 30 minutes. I will not ask the question. It's extremely difficult to compare moderators in greater detail, because he is dealing on the one, on the duas, on the three, but not, and on the decas, but not on the tetractus. So it's a little bit difficult to continue with a comparison, as it is difficult in Numenius. But there is something in moderators which is also of interest, and this is how he is discussing matter. And if I would have far more time, I would discuss the idea in moderators that matter is something in a certain regard which can be labeled as bad, because here we have something which is comparable with the Grande Notice, but this would imply that I'm now going on and comparing all the other following paragraphs, I have only mentioned two, with moderators and Numenius and other contemporary Platonic philosophers. But I think it became quite clear what I would like to demonstrate. The Grande Notice is a mythological exoteric text. And when asking the question what an esoteric teaching lays behind the mythological text, it would become quite clear that all these discussions are an attempt of Christians to move into the contemporary philosophical discussions on the principles, and the interest to show that biblical texts, and especially biblical terms, can be interpreted from the perspective of contemporary Platonic theory of principles. And so this is a kind of attempt of a certain group, the Christians, to move into the contemporary world of learning. And so it's quite interesting to interpret the Grande Notice from this perspective. And I hope I could convince and to a certain extent entertain you by presenting this interpretation. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. It's quite impressive, because in a certain way, what you are telling us is that there is much more philosophical content than we imagine, and then the translations are not revealing this philosophical content. So we have to do a new translation of Irenaeus. I cannot be more happy than now, because it was I was having this feeling when I was writing about Plotinus, the relationship between Plotinus and the Gnostics, and also reading Irenaeus, because I can find a lot of arguments that we can find in Irenaeus, also in the argumentation from Irenaeus against the Gnostics, but also in this Grande Notice that I was always coming again and again. But I never thought just simply to take off the big capitals, how we say, the chapter, the majuscule du text. And of course, we have another lecture of this text, much more philosophical in this way. So thank you very much. It's really, really amazing. But I have a question about, can you have some inches with this new lecture from what was the material that Irenaeus was using to write this Grand Notice?
To my impression, it's quite clear that the Grand Notice is a citation. It's a citation of a Valentinian text because the how to say, the sentences Irenaeus is putting in, you can easily isolate. For example, the beginning, there existed along with them. It's quite clear that that is a kind of redactional sentence of Irenaeus. And then there are three layers. There is the original text, some in between 160 and 80, and a kind of comment of Valentinians. That means also that this is obviously an attempt to link this text with other texts, and probably this explains the mixed impression the text makes, which means it's on one side a mythological narrative like Plutarch or something like this, and at the same time it's like Alkinoos. It's a kind of abridged classroom book for beginners. That I would explain by the reworking of an original text. This text was taken by Irenaeus, and only a very small number of sentences Irenaeus brought in. And I hope when publishing a commentary, and exactly a completely new translation, it must be completely, because the most of the translations we have now are from the 19th century and by people who following the attitude of Irenaeus. This is a text of simple-minded heretical people against the whole majority Christianity, which developed later. And by thinking that probably it should be retranslated by someone familiar with Plutarch, Numenius, and Moderatus, so the similarities, but also the differences will come up immediately, because I have always the impression it's not, if one is allowed to bring in a very simple duality, and all dualities are highly problematic, of a professional philosopher and someone like Maximus of Tyrus. It's more near Maximus of Tyrus. It's not the Numenius or Moderatus level, but it's someone who is convinced I'm able to compete. So the self-confidence is probably higher of those people than their real knowledge of the discussion. It's don't know, a first term, a beginner's discussion of a philosophical lecture.
Mm-hmm. But this new, you are not doing now a new translation of this text. You are planning to do with maybe, I see this very well as a group project, because
yes, that would be a wonderful idea to do it as a group project. And so if, perhaps in the English or French language, that's a wonderful idea, because my commentary is unfinished. There are certain pages and I'm always collecting new material in, but indeed, a commentary on these texts is probably something a lot of people should do. Perhaps we should select as a topic for one of the next terms.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Common reading, translation, and filling in a common commentary. Yeah, that's a wonderful idea.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And maybe I will, before to continue, I will open to the room if someone wants to put some questions. Otherwise, I will talk all the time. I see a hand, maybe? Yes?
Yes, it's me, if that's all right.
Okay, yes, of course.
I wanted to ask about this trajectory that you indicated at the end, very tantalizingly, about the matter in Moderatus and Irenaeus. This is, kind of a fascinating thing in Middle Platonism. The origins of it are a little bit dark. Partially it comes from the association of evil with the dyad, which is already in Aristotle, but then the association of that with Timaeus, the 49 to 52 in Timaeus. We have the Numenius fragment of 52, I believe. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, and also perhaps if you could indicate some references for the connection between Moderatus and Irenaeus that you made.
I think the first thing is that's a wonderful question, but a topic for the next lecture, because I think the structural problem of someone who would like to interpret a biblical text by a Platonic theory of principles is the fall. How to explain the fall, and how to explain the idea that from the biblical narrative, fall is to a certain extent an explanation for evil. And my impression is that those Valentinian so-called Gnostics, a highly problematic term, Gnostics, used certain, I would think, marginal ideas in contemporary Platonism on a relation between matter and how to explain matter and bad, to be quite imprecise, use this because they had the idea, if the biblical narrative is a mythological story and we had to bring it to certain dogmata or to a more philosophical oriented teaching, then we could use these things. And so the interesting thing, what at first sight differs Irenaeus from the philosophical texts is that in the narrative of a kind of generation of the world of ideas in the nous, there is an attempt to bring in the fall into the world, into the divine world. And one of my arguments that this is not a high professional philosophical teaching is that it is not quite clear how matter and the problem of matter is related to the attempt to bring in the world of ideas a fall. I'm often labeling this as a laboratory. That they are trying to ask the question where we can put the biblical fall into a philosophical concept of development, which is in fact no material development. no development in time. And other elements of moderatus, I'm quite sure that neither Irenaeus, neither the Valentinian authors producing the Grande Notice were familiar with moderatus. That's not the level. The first one really familiar with texts is Origen. Origen knows commentaries on Platonic texts. They have heard something. They were familiar by Maximus of Tyrus type literature with those thoughts. So you can only use moderatus, how to say, as an indicator of a certain discussion, and they were familiar with the discussion. So I would answer. It's not possible to the level, the sociological level of the knowledge of those Christian authors in the 2nd century wasn't comparable with professional philosophers. That comes at the end of the 2nd century and in the 3rd century, to a certain extent, Clement and then Origen.
Yes, you can put your question. I'm seeing you. Anne, I don't know. But il faut réactiver le son, Anna. Je sais pas. Oui. Je l'entends pas.
Et là?
Yeah. Oui.
Oui. Thank you very much. It was quite interesting. My question is, if we remember Plotinus in his treatise against the Gnostics in treatise 33, he had noticed that they introduce in the, we can say, the heavenly realm itself, kind of drama with movement and generations and that. And my question is, I agree with you for the rest, but my question is not this mythological narrative an important way to express theological intuition, which cannot be expressed otherwise by this mythological language that, for example, of a strong link between the Son and the Church. We can see the spirit of the Church, and this Church having fallen. So there is in the heavenly realm itself. I don't see it elsewhere, except in those Gnostic, this Gnostic theology. So my question is, this mythological language is perhaps in a way necessary to, that's my, even if the philosophical sources are quite important, I agree with you.
I think the first problem is we haven't non-mythological texts of those Valentinian group, but I'm quite convinced there were some, because the mythological way of presenting is always linked with other texts. That's one of the key elements of Platonic and watered down Platonic thinking. But you are absolutely right. There are certain elements of the mythological narratives which cannot be expressed in a philosophical language which would accept it by Platonic philosophers. That's, I think, the deep reason not only why Plotinus and others rejected this as pseudo-Platonic. It's not only Dörrier who was convinced that Christians weren't able to produce real Platonic thinking because they couldn't how to say to synchronize with things like word soul. It's also that there is the German expression would be Überschuss, something going a mythological more, which cannot be, and the professional Platonic way concerning the mythological more is that's absurd. And probably in the later Christian development, there is an attempt to express the more or something of the more in a different way. And for example, Johannes Zachhuber's patristic philosophy is a way of describing how they attempted to establish philosophical thoughts about the mythological more of the 2nd century, of some of the mythological more of the 2nd century. But thank you very much. That's a wonderful question. Immediately after our meeting, I will write down something that must be included. Many, many thanks. Yes, yes. And you can look to both from the side of those Gnostics, so-called Gnostics, and also from the pagan Platonic viewpoint. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you.
George, if you want to put your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Markschies. That was very interesting indeed. One thing, well, there are many aspects that one can raise with about your talk. That was very interesting. But one thing I would like to sort of ask you is that, namely, what you presented somehow suggests to me, and the question is whether that is sort of a good sort of understanding of what you were presenting, suggests a kind of lifting off the frontiers, the barriers between Middle Platonism, so to speak, or Platonism, and Christian philosophy, right? So would you probably see this as a sort of a common area, namely, and not sort of distinguish the way we sometimes distinguish sharply between, say, pagan philosophy, call it Middle Platonism or Platonism, and sort of early Christian philosophy on the other side. Do you see that as a sort of one area, so to speak?
That's completely depending of the perspective. Looking with the eyes of Plotinus, probably the answer would be, yes, there are people trying to be philosophers, but non sufficit. I'm not convinced. And probably seen from the perspective of the authors, the original authors of the Grande Notice. Yes, we are part of, happy to be in. Please discuss with us. We are part of your community. And so probably they are also interested to be part of other communities. They are not in the sense, but also a professional philosopher is perhaps part of other sociological networks. But it's depending of the perspective. Seen from the perspective of professional philosophers, this is not layman's philosophy, but it's not the same level of professional philosophy. But there was a lot of Middle Platonism in this time, not on the level of don't know, of Numenius, for example, or Plutarch or others. There are Maximus of Tyrus is an example, quite nice to read, but definitely more simpler form. So yes, my interest is to show the fuzzy borders. Fuzzy border is perhaps a nice term. There are borders if we take a certain perspective, Plotinus perspective, but if we change the perspective, then these are quite fuzzy borders or unexisting borders. So that's perhaps the right answer. It's depending, for Irenaeus, there are clear-cut borders in the sense both are heretics, the pagan philosophers and the Gnostics. So it's my pleasure to thank for the wonderful, stimulating discussion, and also for the perspective that we all together will translate and comment, or some of us, that we should discuss. I should come to Paris and we should discuss how to organize this. That's a wonderful idea.
This is a wonderful idea. We was wondering, was also talking about the fact that this text has been very little studied by the philosophers, and also Hippolyte, and we were wondering about that. That is very neglected, this perspective, this study of these texts.
And so, especially since the Nag Hammadi texts
Yes.
came, often Irenaeus is only commented by Nag Hammadi, and that this is a kind of a landscape, and that we should use all the texts, and it's easy to use because we have these wonderful electronic indices, and we have these wonderful commented Lachmann and Duryea Baltus, and these wonderful Collection Budé volumes. It's easy to comment, and a pleasure, and it's also a fascinating idea to do it commonly, yeah, and together, yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that you think so that maybe it is more, how can I say that, he's telling the truth in a way, more than we can imagine. What he's telling, he's not, how can I say that, we can trust in what he's saying in the Grande Notice, if you think that he's much more correct than we thought. Yeah.
This is probably a text used in a living school context, and this school context is a mixture of a religious community and a learned school or school comparable institution. And so there are certain similarities. They are interpreting normative texts, and they're interpreting normative texts according to certain standards of the time. And they're obviously interested to open a kind of conversation or exchange with contemporary philosophers, and to be accepted at the market of philosophies, ideologies, religions, and there are also fuzzy boundaries.
Yes.
Oh, now Dylan is with us. Hi.
Hallo, grüß dich, Christoph.
Yeah.
Oh, Dylan.
Long time not seen.
Ja, ewig nicht gesehen. Good to see you. I just came from class. I wish dearly I could have been here for the talk.
We will have the opportunity to talk again about that, because we're just talking about the idea of working together on a translation of this Grande Notice from Irenaeus, from the philosophical point of view, that it's going in the direction, yes, exactly what we were planning to do. So I'm very, very happy about this this speech. I really thank you very much, very much.